Okay. That's what I have for you today. It's titled Forbidden Love, Medieval Romance as a Critical Race Studies Archive. And my goal here is to talk a bit about why medieval romance, and especially medieval English romance, is such a useful archive for the critical study of race. So when it comes to race and love, we tend to think of their intersection as a deeply modern thing. What's more, we tend to think of it as deeply American. When Werner Solers released his big edited collection on the history of interracial coupling in 2000, he makes the case for its tabooization being particularly American. He writes as follows: "Few people around the world have shared the peculiar ways in which black-white marital relations were prohibited in several English colonies on the American continent. In a great number of American states, often the majority, such prohibitions survived the Revolution, the Civil War, 2 world wars, the League of Nations, and the first few presidencies of the United Nations." And then to drive the point home, he goes on, "Even the word used to describe interracial sexual and marital relations is an Americanism, coined by 2 New York journalists in an 1863 pamphlet." His point is that nowhere else has interracial marriage been as widely prohibited and legislated as it has been in the United States. So it might come then as some surprise that I posit that one of the best archives for understanding the dynamics of such prohibition and taboo is in fact medieval European, perhaps especially English, and also its close cousin French, medieval romance. But this hopefully also makes a little sense to you too, because after all, the prohibition demonstrates a focus on, and perhaps even an obsession with, transgressive love in the discursive work of race thinking and race making. Race and love go together. The medieval romance is the source for many of our great love narratives, the great love of Tristan and Isolde, or Lancelot and Guinevere, for example. Even Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, though early modern, is in many ways a medieval narrative. Any early modernists in the room, I'll fight you on that. Though Shakespeare wrote it, even though he wrote it in early modernity, there's so much Middle Ages in there. When people speak now of being lovesick, for instance, that's a trope that first appears in the romances of the Middle Ages. In England, Chaucer makes much of love sickness in several of his works. But to jump to modernity, and speaking of speak now, those of you who are familiar with the oeuvre of Taylor Swift will know what I'm talking about. When Taylor sings of being enchanted, that's a medieval trope too. And for that matter, when she chooses to wear what all the fashion and celebrity magazines call her, quote, signature red lip, that's also a medieval trope too. The female beloved's lips are always cherry red, her cheeks are blush, her eyes are gray, her hair is blonde. They pretty much look like Taylor Swift. And in fact, and her skin is always white as white can be. And in fact, in one of my favorites to write on, The King of Tars, the beloved skin is described as, quote, white as the feather of a swan. Now that's white. Medieval romance has set the stage for love, and as I've shown in much of my work, for race. Yet the genre does not require romantic love. In fact, romance often means something better preserved in the modern French roman. This basically the same translates as in English as the novel. The medieval roman, like the modern novel, is a story mainly of adventure, a story in which we become invested in a protagonist, in the things that happen to them, in how they and their situation are changed, and how we, the reader, are changed by them. And quite a few romances are mainly about the chivalric exploits of knights, especially Arthur's knights, to be exact, where love is barely present or not even present at all. In Le Chevalier au Lion, or The Knight with the Lion, otherwise known in English as Ewan and Gawain, Ewan conquers a knight, takes his land, takes and falls in love with his wife, and so there is some love in the story. But mostly the story is about how having his own castle and his wife has made him soft. And so therefore he needs to get back out there fighting again. And so he does. Or in a romance such as The Turk and Sir Gawain, where there's really no romantic love at all. It's just about a knight who invades Arthur's court. Gawain then travels with him and is saved by him through a series of impossible adventures, including even tennis with giants. And in all those cases, the Turk, who is a highly racialized figure and is also a quasi-giant himself, saves the Arthurian knight Gawain. This is a story of adventure indeed. But stories of adventure also always involve risk, and this is where love comes back into it. Because whether it's Lancelot or Ewan and Gawain, or the Turk and Sir Gawain, or Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, all of these romances, there are numerous points at which the protagonist might die. And since the text is worked to make us, the readers, invested in him, we're fearful. We jump when, for instance, a flaming lance falls down from the top of an enchanted bed in order to try to skewer a sleeping Lancelot. But of course, ever nightly, he senses it, even in his sleep, and turns just enough that it only grazes his thigh. He then jumps up and destroys that dastardly bed. And perhaps this is why, when the creator of Arthurian romance, Chrétien de Troyes, first includes love in his romances, it's not only the product of challenges conquered, it also involves and introduces risk. In fact, as love was being promoted at the court where Chrétien de Troyes was working, at the court of Marie de Champagne, or Marie de Troyes, the entire goal was to bring into line all these soldiers, these trained warriors. And in order to do that, because they were bringing disorder to the court, so in order to do that, of course, these stories of love would have to enfold risk and violence in order to appeal to them. So the romances I want to spend a few minutes with today combine love and risk pretty spectacularly. Indeed, these romances have become integral to the development and practice of pre-modern critical race studies and its constituent critical medieval race studies, the subfields in which I work, in which I've been working to convince much of medieval studies that it is not the quote-unquote racially innocent and therefore quaint and decidedly non-modern field that it's traditionally purported to be. Perhaps one of the most central texts for pre-modern critical medieval race studies, and one of my favorites to work on again, is The King of Tars. And in this late 13th or early 14th century romance, it features a Roman Christian princess, daughter of the king of a Christian kingdom named Tars. You think, say, Turkey or Armenia in Eastern Europe. Her beauty and knowledge are so renowned that the Sultan of Damascus, who is Muslim, falls for her via her reputation alone. He then wages war on her kingdom until she agrees to marry him so that no more blood will be spilled, and she'll have to convert to Islam too. And then she merely feigns the conversion, and this is all well and good until they try to have a child, an heir, and it doesn't work. She bears instead a blob of undifferentiated flesh with no features, no face, no bones, no limbs. In the literature, we call this the lump child. That is the official name for this blob, the lump child. And the Sultan figures rather correctly that this is just a lump child because she has not fully converted to Islam, that she hasn't really converted. And he's right. So they strike a deal. If his gods, and medieval Christian popular discourse regularly conflates Islam with paganism, and presents Islam as polytheistic. So if his gods can make this blob, this lump child, into a real baby, then she will really convert. But if that doesn't work, her Christian god gets a try. And if her god can do it, then the Sultan agrees that he will convert. Now guess what? In this Christian text by Christians and for Christians, guess who wins? Right. So, her God does it. The baby becomes a beautiful little baby named John. He agrees to convert. And when he does, there's a racial miracle that comes with it. His skin, that according to the text was, quote, black and loathly, becomes all white and, quote, shines without blemish. The King of Tars has served as a touchstone for my theory of medieval race thinking, as well as for my fellow traveler Geraldine Heng's theory of medieval race making. But I want to assert that in it, love, here the Sultan's desire for the princess, is a vehicle for the text's main racializing concern, the triumph of Christianity over Islam. And given that romance has become a central pillar in the study of race in the Middle Ages, and that it's long been central to the study of the Middle Ages period, it's worth asking why. So why is romance in particular a worthy critical race studies archive? Well, there are some obvious reasons. Romances regularly include supernatural elements that are spectacular, and these are especially helpful when asserting a connection between race and religious identity, like the King of Tars does. Romances also include protagonists who we can empathize with, even well before the psychological interiority of characters that define the modern novel. Romances also tend toward neat endings in which readers get to experience satisfactory resolution. The character who starts out in a stable home is forced by circumstance to become a wanderer and finally gets to return home, safe if changed. Yet, all this, and still when I say romance, you probably get either warm, fuzzy feelings, cold and angry feelings, or active disinterest. Right? The word and concept are so deeply embedded in modernity and in culture that it's hard to avoid having a reaction. Indeed, near the beginning of his 1936 masterwork on the subject, C.S. Lewis here, seen here having a puff, C.S. Lewis writes in his Allegory of Love about the development of courtly love. He writes that it effected a change in which has left no corner of our ethics, our imagination, or our daily life untouched. And they erected impassable barriers between us and the classical past. Compared with this evolution, the Renaissance is a mere ripple on the surface of literature. Or in other words, the world before courtly love is impossible to imagine in all its bareness, for this would require us to wipe out of our minds for a moment nearly all that makes the food of both modern sentimentality and modern cynicism. We must conceive of a world emptied of that ideal of happiness, a happiness grounded on successful romantic love, which still supplies the motive of our popular fiction. Or for that matter, our popular music, from Taylor's or Beyoncé's corpus all the way to something like Bridgerton, love continues to entertain us just as much nearly 100 years after Lewis wrote those words, and with about 1 million more ways to consume it. Perhaps one reason we turn to romance in order to understand the development of race is because it inspires very strong affective and emotional responses. And affect and emotion are elements of the human experience that are deeply involved in race thinking and race making, too. Depictions of black enslaved people in the U.S. throughout the 19th century regularly showed them to be content, happy, and always smiling. Since race thinking and race making tends to trade in a lot of impossible contradictions, the opposite, the post-slavery 20th century stereotype of the always angry black woman, that produces fear in those around her who identify differently and who she might blame for things or might be angry at, that is also a strong affective response. Another reason we turn to romance in PCRS and CMRS is that the genre serves as a harbor for what Geraldine Heng has called cultural fantasy. Cultural fantasy is a means of managing the indiscussable, what is unthinkable and unsayable by other means. And Heng devises this term in particular to deal with cannibalism in crusading romances. Yet cultural fantasy is not limited to the horrifying. It's also a space for imagining that which is desirable, though unlikely to come to pass. So in a text like the Turk and Sir Gawain, where that dark-skinned, likely Muslim Turk turns out to be none other than a member of King Arthur's court, just in disguise. He turns out to be someone named Sir Gromer, or Sir Gromet, and he was mystically disguised. Here, the unthinkable or the unsayable, which is his true identity being masked in a racialized form, but also the way that identity is revealed, which involves an act of beheading. All of that leads to the really wonderful thing of reunification between members of King Arthur's Round Table. And in fact, that surprise ending registers another form of love, the chivalric and the homosocial sort of love. Lewis writes as follows about that. The Christian and Germanic period had existed for several centuries before the new feeling, that is love, appeared. Love, in our sense of the word, is as absent from the literature of the early Middle Ages as that of classical antiquity. Their favorite stories were not, like ours, stories of how a man married or failed to marry, or a woman. They preferred to hear how a holy man went to heaven or a brave man went to battle. And it goes on that the deepest of worldly emotions in this period is the love of man for man, the mutual love of warriors who died together fighting against the odds, and the affection between vassal and lord. So even when there is romantic love between man and woman involved, he claims that theme isn't the preeminent one. And when it is treated, it's usually treated in order to show or demonstrate something about, and in fact, maybe even to show the importance of the love between male warrior and male warrior. So, that is to say, romance texts that we might expect to end with romantic triumph, such as Gawain and the Green Knight, which does have a heterosexual seduction narrative in it, end instead with the triumph of love and acceptance between male warriors and male warriors. Romance, as the genre of cultural fantasy, also reflects the complex dynamics of negotiation between self and other that inform race. Let's see. Romance is cultural fantasy in its negotiation of self and other. I want to get that show there. Yeah. Connect most spectacularly with the concept and dynamics of race, in that both medieval romance and modern race recognize and require a kind of refraction of the self through the other. So this is precisely the case in Iwan and Gawain, or Le Chevalier au Lion. When Gawain's love for his new wife, Alandine, runs smack into the requirements of knighthood, when his own honor is threatened because he has spent too long at home with her. So his buddy shows up, his buddy Gawain shows up and says, Iwan, you've got to come out and start fighting again. And this is how he convinces him. He says to him, he said, Sire, if thou leert ham, wandere men will their blame, that knicht is no thing to set be, that leves all his chivalry and leaves back on in his bed. When he haves a lady wed, for one that has grat undose, then what time to win his loss, for one a knicht is chivalrous, his lady is the more jalouse, and also she loves him well the bat, therefore, sir, thou shall not let to hunt armes in ilk contraire, then will men well more press there. Right? So in other words, he says, if you lie at home, men will blame you. It's shameful for a knight to leave behind all his chivalry and lie warming in his bed when he's wed a lady. For when he has great support, right, when he has great amounts of money, that's the time to go win reputation. For when a knight is chivalrous, his lady will become the more jealous, right? And she'll love him the better. And therefore, don't stop haunting arms. Don't stop seeking chivalric honor. Then everyone will praise you more. So in other words, it's shameful for a knight to remain at home with his wife. He should be out seeking honor. And to stay home is just to court blame and shame. What he's telling us here is that he's telling Iwan, that he's being seen, he should see himself through the eyes of others and make judgments accordingly and act accordingly. Ewen goes for it, hook, line, and sinker, to the point that he even takes too long before he comes home and almost loses his wife and everything else. But he was having such a good time with his buddies. How could he not? So for our purposes today, that what's most important is that he only heads off with the Arthurian retinue, with Gawain and the others, because of how others see him. The blame and shame is in Gawain's eyes, and Ewen hadn't given any thought to being blamed or shamed until Gawain shows up and tells him, see yourself through the eyes of others. So this brings me to another reason that the study of race's medieval development engages romance. Because race, as we understand it now, has a whole lot to do with the relationship between how others see us and how we see ourselves. W.E.B. Du Bois here in 1903, the great sociologist, activist, writer, first black man to earn a PhD at Harvard, published his Souls of Black Folk in 1903. And it's a work of sociology, memoir, literature, and central to the development of modern critical race studies. And one reason it's so central is because it develops a theory known as double consciousness, which he describes as follows. This sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two thoughts, two souls, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Similar to the chivalric and gendered self through the eyes of others that Ewen experiences. And then Ewen goes on to experience a year of madness in the forest, having lost his mind because of what he has gone through. Medieval romance, in fact, offers us the ability to explore the psychic pain that is similar to modern racial experience, to explore the psychic pain that develops from the dynamic of double consciousness. So the dynamic interplay between the Middle Ages, especially its romance, and the modern black experience did not escape Du Bois himself, because Du Bois went on to write several medievalist texts himself, even in his Souls of Blackness. He does identify one of the roots of modern racialization as the 15th century. He refers to black Americans as, quote, swept on by the current of the 19th century, while yet struggling in the eddies of the 15th. Right. So again, why romance? The strong, effective, and emotional responses that romances elicit, the dynamic relation between the unthinkable or the undiscussable and the desirable that is the politics of cultural fantasy. Romance's penchant for dramatizing double consciousness and inviting the reader to experience a protagonist's psychic pain. So to close with the supposed modernity and Americanism of interracial love, let me venture just one more vector on which medieval romance calls forth its use by those studying the medieval history of race: interracial marriage itself. And here we have Moses finding his wife in a 15th century historiated Bible. Recall earlier that I mentioned the Princess of Tars, quote, white as a feather of swan, and the Sultan of Damascus with his hide that black and loathly was, which was an interracial marriage if there ever was one. Their skin color, as I've argued in a bunch of places, was for medievals more a marker of their religious identity. And that religious identity, that was where their essential difference was thought to be located. As I pointed out earlier, the prohibition and tabooization of interracial marriage has been taken as a uniquely New World thing. And as a 20th century Jamaican-American historian John Augustus Rogers put it in his 3-volume history, Sex and Race, quote, any prohibition of marriage between white and black at all began in the New World. And the United States is the only country in the New World which has carried its laws against the marriage of white and black from its colonial period into its national one. While this is true in a strictly legal and policy sense, The King of Tars and medieval romance more generally offer such racial spectacle that we can have a sense of what was going on in the heads and hearts of writers and readers, even when it did not make it into laws. Medieval romance is a gift that allows us to understand the interior dynamics of race and racism, as well as the all too often forbidden love, whose presence or exclusion, even today, vexes some, horrifies others, and gives many of the rest of us life. Thanks.